Hello and welcome back to the channel, where today we're talking about how in my last video I was wrong. In my last video I was talking about how Cunning Action was intended to be an additional action in the rogue's turn. So I suggested that the rogue gets an action, a bonus action, and a Cunning Action in its action economy. And this, a lot of people in the comments pointed out, well, not a lot of people, but people in the comments pointed out that this is not correct. This is not how the rules is written, interpret the turns. And so in the rules is written in the player's handbook, it specifically states that you get an action and movement on your turn, and you only get a bonus action if you have something that allows you to take one. And the example used in the player's handbook is actually the Cunning Action of the rogue. And the people in the comments rightly pointed out that if this example is used, then it's clearly meant to be a bonus action, and thus I'm wrong. And honestly, when you're wrong, you're wrong. You admit it, you move on, and that's what I'm doing here. I was wrong. Cunning Action is indeed meant to be a bonus action, and that's kind of it. And I was gonna just leave it at that and talk about something else, but then something interesting happened. Somebody showed up in the comments and suggested that to arrive at the conclusion I did, you would need to be disabled. And while I understand that throws will be throws, I also found it a little bit fascinating, and it got me thinking, is it really such an out there idea that Cunning Action could be an additional action? That somebody would think, legitimately think, that you'd need to be disabled to arrive at the conclusion. That gave me the idea for this video. And in this video, I'm gonna take you through the process I use to interpret rules typically when I'm playing any type of TTRPG or tabletop game in general, and see if my reasoning is really that, I don't know, that unhinged, let's call it, or is there a little bit more to it? So before I get into it, I feel like I should say this up front. In my time, I have personally worked on some designs for tabletop games myself, and not just tabletop games. I've also designed certain things, certain mechanics specifically for a few video games. Some of them were used, some of them were not used, and which ones is kind of irrelevant, so I'm not going to sit here and list them for you. But over the course of me working on these things, I learned some important things, and one of them was that when you write any type of tabletop game, there are two general, and I mean very general, ways you can approach it. One is wording and the other is phrasing. So the difference between wording and phrasing is that when you use wording, a method for conveying meaning that I personally find much inferior to phrasing, every single word and every comma and every a and the etc. have to be used very specifically and very deliberately, and misusing them in any way could cause confusion or can just cause your mechanics to not work, either not work as intended or not work at all. A good example of a game that uses wording is the popular card game Yu-Gi-Oh! And a good example in Yu-Gi-Oh! Of how wording can break a mechanic and make it not work as intended is the card Guardian Yatos. So Guardian Yatos, I'll give you a quick rundown just to give you the idea. So Guardian Yatos is a creature that uses equip cards, which in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a type of spell card. You send an equip card equipped to her to the graveyard and she boosts her own power. And Guardian Yatos has a weapon that's designed specifically for her, which when it's sent to the graveyard is meant to boost the power of Guardian Yatos even further, and this boost is permanent, unlike her own, which is temporary only until the end of the turn. However, the issue there is that the wording, the specific text on the sword, the way it's worded, suggests that it has to be the last thing that happens in order for the effect to actually work. And because when Guardian Yatos sends it to the graveyard and uses her effect afterwards to boost her power, the last thing that happens is not the sword going to the graveyard, and therefore it doesn't work. And this was stated to not have been the intent, but somebody got it wrong, and using the word when instead of if in the description of the Celestial Sword, Guardian Yatos' weapon, completely broke the intended mechanic. And so this is a good example of why I personally consider wording to be inferior. The other way you can convey the meaning and the idea behind your design is through phrasing. Now, with phrasing, you're using a specific structure of sentences, and the specific words you use, even though there are terms you can use or keywords, depending on what type of game you're designing, typically when you're phrasing, you can use specific words and even keywords out of the context of being keywords and just use them as the word they are. And in that case, the overall structure of the sentence will still convey the meaning that you originally intended. And this is important because D&D, at least in my experience, and I've been playing since 3.5, although to be fair, I got in at the end of 3.5, mostly played 4th edition, and then I got into 5th edition a little bit after it released, about 2 to 3 years after it released, and the difference between 4th edition and 5th edition was quite jarring. But over the years, I've come to realize that primarily D&D uses the phrasing method to convey meaning rather than just using specific wording. And this made interpreting D&D a lot more simple for me, because if I found confusing wording somewhere, I could just look at the overall structure of the sentence and still be able to figure out what they were talking about. And so when I was reading the Rogue specifically, I'm gonna skip over the whole spiel about reading the rules in general. When I was looking at the Rogue specifically, I found the way Cunning Action was worded very peculiar, because there were other things that were described as bonus actions in the game, but it never said that it was something you can take every turn in combat, even if it was actually something you could do every turn. And it never really said you can only use it in this and that way. It would usually just say, you can take a bonus action to do this, or you can take a bonus action to do that. And then the player's handbook clarifies that you can only do one thing that's a bonus action per turn. And that was fair enough. But Cunning Action used a very particular sentence structure to convey what I essentially initially thought was the same meaning. And I agreed. Initially, I thought the same as everybody else. Cunning Action is, in fact, just a bonus action. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, was that really the intent? And so I started looking through the game for things that do similar things and see how they were phrased. And most things that did similar things, as I showed in my previous video, aren't phrased the same as Cunning Action. And then I figured, okay, so let's see what is phrased the same as Cunning Action. And the first thing I found was haste. And haste gave an additional action. And here's where it got a little interesting for me, because in the player's handbook, a bonus action is described as an additional action that's called a bonus action. And I found this interesting. I wondered, what if what haste does for a normal action is the same as Cunning Action is intended to do for a bonus action? And so I started looking through the game for anything that would refer specifically to Cunning Action outside of the rulebooks, because the rulebooks do use it as an example for a lot of things, and I can't actually say that that's wrong, although I could say it's a bit of a bad example, and you'll see why. But that's only from the perspective of the conclusion I arrived in my last video. So just bear with me and let me take you through the process and you'll see what I mean. Anyway, I wondered if Cunning Action was meant to do for bonus actions the same thing that haste does for an action. It gives you an additional one, but it has very limited use. And so I started looking through the game for any other bonus action that might be worded the same way as Cunning Action to first disprove my idea, and I couldn't find any. Cunning Action was an outlier, and it was phrased the same as haste. So then I started looking for abilities that would refer to Cunning Action, because if I found one, that would indicate that Cunning Action is perhaps in some ways meant to be special. And D&D has a specific rule that tells you that there are specific scenarios in D&D that overrule the general rules. And this would fall into that category. The general rule being that you can take one bonus action on your turn, But if cunning action was meant to be an outlier, it would be a specific case that overrules the general rule and instead give you two bonus actions. One that you can do anything else with, and one that you can only do cunning action related things with. And I didn't have to look far. I had to just read the thief rogue more carefully, and I got to fast hands. And I pointed to fast hands in my previous video where I read its text, and it says that you can use the bonus action granted to you by the rogue's cunning action to do a certain number of other things. And I found this very strange because to me, from a purely design perspective, as somebody who's designed things, it made no sense to me to refer specifically to the bonus action granted to you by cunning action if it's not meant to be special. And so the specific phrasing of cunning action that sounds similar to haste and fast hands referring to the bonus action granted to you by cunning action, rather than just saying you can do all of these things as a bonus action, I took that as enough evidence to conclude that yes, cunning action is intended to be a bonus action that you can take in addition to whatever other bonus action you might have. And so after that, I scoured the rule books for anything that could disprove that. And of course, I eventually reached the Sage Advice Compendium, which is supposed to clarify rules and give you an idea of how everything is meant to work. And I was quite, not shocked, but I found it very interesting that the compendium never really mentions cunning action outside of using it as an example. Or the other time it mentions it, it's talking about, I believe it was Expedient Retreat, and how you can't use the cunning action dash and expedient retreat with a bonus action because both of them use a bonus action. But even though that essentially disproves my thought process at the time, I also read in that same compendium that there are three ways to interpret rules. There's the RAW, rules is written, which is clearly what this is referring to. Rules is written, cunning action is a bonus action. But there's also RAI, which is rules is intended. And so the way cunning action was worded and the way fast hands refers to specifically the bonus action granted to you by cunning action, I had pretty good reason to think that the rules as intended were not quite the same as the rules as written. And so I figured, okay, rules as written, it's meant to be a bonus action that uses your bonus action, but what if the rules as intended meant for it to be an additional bonus action? And so the last thing the compendium talks about is rules as fun. And my conclusion was, that's just more fun. It's better for the rogue overall from a design perspective, and I will talk about that in a moment, but it's also more fun. And honestly, if you haven't tried it, which I assume most people haven't, because it's a pretty well established thing that cunning action is just your bonus action. But if you haven't tried it, I would encourage you to try it in your game. Or if your group isn't interested in trying it, just download the video game Baldur's Gate 3 and play an assassin rogue, and then try switching to a thief rogue and use one of the thief's rogue's additional bonus actions as just cunning action. And you immediately notice the difference. When you play the one with just an action and bonus action, where you can dash, disengage, hide, all of that is just a bonus action, it's good, but it feels like something's missing. And then when you play the thief, and you have essentially a regular turn, and then on top of that you can do the cunning action things, suddenly it feels different. It feels a lot more interesting, a lot more tactical, and generally, overall, it just feels better. So that's just the player experience, the fun factor, cunning action as an additional bonus action, and yes, my conclusion was that it's meant to be an additional bonus action that is outside of the action economy, which over the years of playing, I just started calling an additional action for the sake of simplicity. And it's just like, for the sake of simplicity, I consider that you have one action, one bonus action, one reaction, your movement. That's it. It's more simple this way, and I don't need to throw the book at somebody every time I need to talk about their turn. I just say you get one action, one bonus action, movement, one reaction, that's it. And then when people play a rogue, I add one cunning action to that. And overall, players who played it have had fun with it. So anyway, talking about the design perspective now, because as somebody, like I said, as somebody who's designed things in the past, to me, the design of the rogue as having the cunning action as an additional bonus action rather than just its normal bonus action just made sense. Because when you're designing a game like this, you have different categories for different classes, and the category I would put the rogue in is what I personally would call the lightweight marshals. Lightweight marshals being martial characters, ones that primarily focus on using a weapon for everything and sometimes might have limited spellcasting, but generally would just focus primarily on weapons and martial disciplines such as fighting styles, etc. And the lightweight martials in D&D, the ones I would categorize as such, would be the barbarian, the rogue, the ranger, and the monk. And so when I looked at the designs of all of these classes, something stood out to me, and that was that the rogue was the only one out of all of them that didn't inherently gain a movement speed buff. The ranger got its movement increased, the barbarian got its movement increased, and the monk had inherent movement increases in its kit. All of them got their movement increased, and then when Tasha's came out around 2020, this was reinforced. The rogue again didn't get any movement increase, so that was clearly not an oversight. But the barbarian got instinctive pounce, which was yet another movement enhancement. The ranger got it basically got reworked completely, and it got a lot of movement increases, and it also got a lot of extra movement speeds. The monk, not so much, but the monk was already really fast to begin with, and monks could dash already as a bonus action. Rangers got a bunch of abilities and spells and that they could use to also dash as a bonus action. And so, to me, it felt like the only way it made sense for the rogue, which the fantasy of the rogue is quite literally that you're this really quick and nimble combatant that will always slip in and out of the shadows, be the fastest one on the battlefield. The only way it made sense to me that this would be the only class that doesn't get movement speed baked into its kit is if it had a way to get that movement speed another way without necessarily interfering with its regular turn. And so, from a purely design perspective, to me, it made a lot more sense for Cunning Action to be an additional bonus action, because now you can use Cunning Action to dash, disengage, or hide, giving you that nimbleness and that mobility that you would expect from a rogue, while also giving you the same options, such as using Poisoner to poison your weapon to stab somebody, or using 2 daggers to stab somebody, or throwing 2 daggers. The only way that worked was through Cunning Action being an additional bonus action. And so when Tasha's came out, and it didn't change anything about the rogue, it just gave it the terrible steady aim ability. And yeah, I still think steady aim is terrible, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But when Tasha's came out and the rogue didn't really get anything other than steady aim, I concluded that, yeah, this makes sense. Why would you enhance the speed of something that can just dash for free every turn? And so that's how I kind of reached this conclusion. And all of the rules that I read about it, everything was referring to essentially just the rules as written, but I never really saw anything that talks about intent. And, well, to be fair, it is very arrogant of me to assume what somebody would intend, like how would I know? But at the same time, it made sense. It made sense from a design perspective, it made sense from a fun perspective. It just made sense to me that this would be the intent. And so over the years of using it this way, I became a little bit, I would definitely say, complacent in thinking that, yeah, I know better than everybody. I don't. Fair enough, I got called out again, I own it. But I hope this was insightful and entertaining, at least, to kind of see how I reached that conclusion, and that To me, just reading the rules as written and just going with that isn't always the be-all end-all. I would always try to peek into what the developer might have been intending, and I will always try to make sense of it from a design perspective. And as I already said a few times, and I gave examples in my original video about this as well, from a design perspective and from a fun perspective, this just made more sense to me. So there you have it. That's how I reached the conclusion that Cunning Action was meant to be an additional action. And I guess my initial video, it comes across as a bit angry and, I don't know, upset maybe, because I was really hoping that in one D&D the rogue would get enhanced in some way, because obviously everyone who's read any of the UA and any of the information out there knows that the rogue got basically boned. There's no way around it. It got boned. Sneak attacks can no longer crit. They're only once per round instead of once per turn, which from a design perspective does make sense that they would be once per round. But taking away their ability to crit basically puts the rogue at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to damage. And a way to fix this would be to allow rogues to use poison on their weapons as a bonus action. But if you did, that suddenly clashes with steady aim, it clashes with their cunning action as a bonus action, and it clashes with the general design of the rogue. It basically says you're either doing damage and nothing else, or you're doing rogue things and nothing else. And I don't think that's a very good design necessarily. It feels weird, like something's missing there. And so I was really hoping that if I'm correct about the intent behind Cunning Action, it would be considered when redesigning the rogue. And Cunning Action would become a solid thing that's an additional bonus action for the rogue and allow you to do both rogue things and choose to deal damage or choose to do something else with your turn. And when that didn't happen, I suppose I was a little upset, which, fair, people get upset about all kinds of random things, and while Rogue isn't my primary class, I'm much more of a Warlock guy. I just wanted to put a video out there that would get people talking about this and maybe potentially bring the idea to Wizards of the Coast, so that even if it doesn't get an errata right away as the rulebook's release, maybe down the line they would consider it, playtest it internally, and actually try Cunning Action as an additional bonus action, rather than just leaving the rogue as it is in this weird limbo where one D&D is about to put it. And quite honestly, I fully intend to continue using Cunning Action as an additional bonus action, and I will very likely ignore a lot of the changes to the rogue at my table because I don't personally consider them good changes. The class itself, the base class, didn't change much. It just got steady aim as part of its normal features now, which, again, terrible ability, and quite honestly, I'm extremely thankful that the Soul Knife, which is the rogue subclass that I like, I'm extremely thankful that that subclass actually can ignore steady aim's existence all the way through. Thank you. Anything that gets me away from that ability, I'm very, very much for. But anyway, I was kind of just hoping that the base rogue would be better. I was hoping to see it get more 2 proficiencies or gaming set proficiencies or anything like that, so you can really lean into that fantasy. I was hoping it would get a feature like the Artificer's 2 expertise, where you'd just become an expert with all the tools and gaming sets you have available, and then you would be able to spend all of your expertise on actual skills to give you more expert skills. I was hoping it would have, in general, more proficiencies over the course of its development, and overall I was hoping it would be better and its fantasy would be enhanced. And what I saw was that its fantasy wasn't really enhanced. It actually got somehow worse. Now, not only does your sneak attack not crit, which rogues in every game they're the ones known for critting and hurting a lot when they do, and now you can't even do that. So, I don't know. I was just extremely disappointed. I wanted to put out a video that would get people talking and hopefully get the rogue changed. I made some assumptions in that video. I made a bit of a fool of myself. A bunch of people got their laughs off of it, which is fair enough. if you're gonna look stupid, might as well get laughed at. But I also think that even though the presentation and the overall vibe of the video was off and wrong, and even the information was not accurate entirely, I still think that Cunning Action as an additional bonus action is definitely worth talking about. Because if you actually tried it, either with Baldur's Gate that I described, or just sit down at your table and try it with your friends, I think you'd find that it enhances the rogue's fantasy a lot more. And all of the other changes that a lot of players agree, it's not just me, that aren't good changes, I can't crit once per round, etc. This will add a little bit more rogueness back to it, and I definitely think that's worth talking about. But anyway, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Cunning Action is an additional action, ludicrous idea. Is my thought process completely whack? Let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.